Okay, so maybe this is stretching a little bit the topic of philosophy, but I do want to speak about. I'm just going to mute everyone. I'm getting a bit of interference here. Mute all. I want to speak a little bit about, or not a little bit. I want to spend a few weeks on something that I touched upon that started in my Shabbos HaGadol drasha, and we didn't manage to explore fully. In hindsight, maybe it was a bit too large a topic to bite off for Shabbos HaGadol drasha, and certainly I didn't get as far as I wanted to in it. Even though we're going to be interrupted now for a couple of weeks till after Shavuos, I think it's worth starting with this topic before Shavuos because it's one quite integral to Matan Torah and Kabbalah Torah and what Torah is. And this is the relationship, or the concept rather, of Ein Mikra Yotze Miydai Peshuto, that every pasuk has a Peshat, and in addition it has a Midrashic reading. And I think I lost them on my papers. And I wanted to spend a bit of time exploring the nature of Midrash. What exactly is Midrash? How does Midrash interact with Peshat? And I've lost my notes. Okay, that one. How does Midrash interact with Peshat? And what is Midrash? What's it doing to Passukim? So what I really want to do is try and explore several models or suggestions. And this question is really key or critical because when we learn Chumash, we are conscious that we're learning or reading a text, which is pretty notes. Sorry, just to see if I can find my notes on this. Here we are. We're conscious when we learn Midrash that we're reading a text which is pretty unclear, pretty difficult to. When we learn Passukim, a text that's pretty difficult to understand. And in addition, the stories of Midrash and the explanations of Midrash are very bound up in our reading of the Passukim. And there's much discussion in I think amongst Rabbonim, amongst the laity, amongst educators, as to what degree that relationship is a healthy one or not. Is it good that we if you ask someone to summarize a story in the Torah, they're almost unsure as to what comes from Peshuto, Shel, Mikra, what's actually in the Passukim, and what's Midrash. And one stance would be this is a chesaron, this is a failure, this is a lack of understanding, because we should know what's Passukim, what's Torah Shabbat, and we should know what's Midrash, which comes from somewhere else. And the alternative position is, well, Midrash is the deeper and fuller reading of the Passukim, and therefore why not have the fullest version of the story? So what is Midrash, and where does it come from, and how does it relate to the simplest reading of the Passukim? Is an important topic and an important debate. This is with respect to stories. For example, the whole story of Avraham being thrown into the fiery furnace, as far as the written Torah is concerned, is really a couple of words. Hashem says to Avraham, I took you out from Ur Kasdim, and Ur Kasdim can either be translated as a city called Ur, that belongs to the Kasdim, to the Chaldeans, or it can be translated as Ur Kasdim, the furnace of Kasdim. Ur is the Hebrew word for a furnace, for fire. And Hashem is saying, I took you out of the fire of the Kasdim. So sort of a whole significant story that, and I think most kids, most of us, if you said, tell me about the life of Avraham, this would feature very heavily in the life of Avraham. And yes, it's not obvious that it's Peshuto, Shel, Mikra at all. And then we have Rashi. So probably the Midrashim that are best known are the Midrashim that Rashi brings, right? Most of us don't spend our time going to every Midrash in Shemos Rabbah or even Haggadot or Gemaras, but we're familiar starting with the Midrashim that Rashi brings. Rashi tells us that any I'm coming to explain the Peshuto Shel Mikra. So what was Rashi's model of how these Midrashim fit? So this is important in the realm of narrative and story, and it's also important, as we will see, in the realm of halacha. Because what we call Midrash, we often think of it as narrative Midrashim, but the truth is that there's a parallel thing going on, which is also really called Midrash. They call it Midrash Halacha, which takes Passukim and adds to them layers of meaning which aren't obvious either, and these have enormous halachic ramification. So why do we not call these Midrash? Because a lot of these Midrashim, of course, feature in the Gemara. Right? When we learn Gemara, the Gemara interprets Passukim, And we have collections of freestanding midrashim, which bring many of these interpretations. We refer to them as the Sifra, the Sifri, the Torah's Kohanim. These are Midrash halacha. So if you look at a Torah, on the Torah is written two parallel commentaries of Chazal. One commentary is narrative, which we call the Midrashim, Shmos Rabbah, Vayikra Rabbah, and one commentary of Chazal or Midrash halacha, Midrashim halacha, which we call the Sifra, the Sifri, the Torah's Kohanim, and the like. The halachic Midrash has been systemized and analyzed very rigorously by the Gemara, and the narrative Midrash less so. There's a few agads the Gemara brings, but these both add layers of meaning to the Passukim, and it's not at all obvious what Chazal's picture was of how these layers of meaning interact with the simplest reading of the Passukim. And finally, as we grapple with difficult Passukim nowadays, to what degree is it legitimate to take Passukim out of their simple value or to add layers of meaning to them? And I'm here referring to maybe some of the questions around the Metzias as described by the Torah, Torah and science, Torah and history and the like. To what degree are we allowed to sort of re-look at Passukim and interpret them non-literally and the like? So if we just step back for a few minutes, there's very famously the Torah is read on numerous levels. Commonly nowadays we refer to these as parados, pshat, which is perhaps a simple or plain meaning, remez, which is some sort of hinted meaning, drush, which is midrashim and drushes of Chazal in halacha, and soid, which are the secrets of the Torah, some sort of Kabbalistic level reading. This phrase parados doesn't appear directly in Chazal, or not as we have it. It comes from Moshe Dion, one of the Sfadi Rishonim. He sort of brings this phrase parados, but it seems it antedated him. He's perhaps the first one who put it into writing, but it seems to have been a sort of known phrase that summarizes these four levels of the Torah. But we don't need to get caught up in semantics. The concept of multi-tiered reading is one that's very clear to anyone who peruses Midrashim or Chazal. And therefore the question of exactly how we understand it is an important one. And underlying all of this is really four assumptions that Chazal had about the text. Again, these four assumptions are very, very clear when you learn Mishnah or Gemara or Midrash. It's very clear that Chazal had these four assumptions. I'm not aware of any traditional source that laid out these four assumptions in this format. It comes from academics, but but they're drawing something which is not controversial. This is not a traditional versus academic debate. It's clear that they're correct, that these are the sort of four assumptions that Chazal came into reading Torah about. When I say assumptions, I don't mean that these are unfounded, chas v'shalom. I simply mean there's four principles or foundational presumptions that they have about how the text works, which are integral to their reading of the text. The first assumption they make is that it's okay for Torah to be cryptic. That's not a problem. In other words, if you read a cheap popular novel and you have to spend hours trying to work out what it's saying, it doesn't fulfill your assumption about what sort of text you were going to get. You expect it to be clearly laid out. If you read a child's textbook, it's a flaw in the book if it's not clearly laid out. If you read a high-level work, whether a Shakespeare or maybe a very technical journal or manual, you expect it to be cryptic in the sense that you understand it's using very technical language, or maybe it's deliberately in very metaphorical language, very poetic language. And you understand sort of part of the experience it's offering you is the analysis and reasoning of the cryptic and unclear, in a sense, nature of the text. So Chazal understood that Torah was okay to be cryptic. It was okay that it would say A and sometimes it would mean B after a lot of thought. That's the nature of the text. That's one assumption, one presumption they had about how the text worked together. I don't mean an assumption that was assumed. This was the Masorah they had, but that this is a basic sort of premise that they're coming in to reading the text. The second assumption that they had, and this is very clear from Rashi right at the beginning of the Torah, is that it's a text that's meant to teach us something. It's meant to tell us something real about the world. It's not just history or academic or interesting. It's got a message to it. Rashi famously opens with Bereshis, and he says, what's the whole point of this? It's an amazing question. I think it's a question any of us would ask nowadays. What's the whole point of the creation story? Why do we need it all? What's it telling us? It should have started with the Chodesh Elochem. It should start with the first mitzvah. So Rashi, and this is again clear in Chazal, it's not controversial, are coming with an assumption that the Torah is meant to teach us something. So again, if you're reading a cheap novel, or even maybe reading Shakespeare, you're not necessarily bothered. You understand it's an entertainment work. You're not necessarily bothered by, okay, L'maisa Tachlis, how does it make my life different? How does it, what message does it give me? What does it tell me I ought to do? Even great work of art, we expect it to have an insight to it. Maybe it changes how we see the world, but we don't necessarily expect it to have an imperative to it, an instruction to it. So again, this is a sort of assumption about how the Torah works. The third assumption, again, not controversial, is that there shouldn't be contradictions in the Torah. It should be a consistent text. Now, we need to line that up with number one, that we can expect it to be cryptic and say A and B mean B, and it's possible that the Torah can approach things from different angles and allude to different layers, but basically we expect it to be a consistent text. It wouldn't be okay if we have two Passukim that outright clash with each other, unless we have some way of resolution. And the point I'm making about these four assumptions, I'll come to the fourth in a moment, is that all four demand interpretation. All four say this isn't a lazy text. It's not just a text that you can read and someone expect it just to reveal itself easily. It has secrets that need to be uncovered. And finally, of course, the most basic assumption of all is that this is a text from Hashem. This is a divine text, right? This isn't a regular human text. Those are the four assumptions which Chazal has about how the Torah works. And again, even though they're not laid out explicitly by our sources, the academics have sort of drawn them out from looking at the works of Chazal. I think that none of them are particularly controversial. So the question is, in resolving all these four assumptions, what tools do Chazal have? Well, in a way, that's Peshat, Remez, Drush, and Soid. Those are the ways that we resolve these contradictions. What's the relationship between Peshat and Midrash? And basically, I'm going to argue that if we look in Chazal and the Rishonim, you see more or less three models. There's a model in which they complement each other. You need both. You can't really expect the text to be understood without both of them. There's a model in which they're alternatives. And there's a third model in which they're deeper layers, they're sort of strata or layers of meaning. And I want to start with a couple of examples of these. One of which I mentioned when I spoke in public in Shabbos Gadol, one of which I didn't get up to. I don't think I got up to, and just look at them. The first is in interpreting Passukim. In some ways, the system of trop, of laning notes and vowels, is in a way the first Torah Sheba'al Peh explanation of the Torah. So if we ask ourselves, what's the oldest Perush on the Torah, the oldest commentary on the Torah? Maybe at first you'll be tempted to say Chazal, like Gemara or something like that. Then maybe you'll push back in time and you'll say the Targum, right? The Targumim date back to very early. Maybe you'll say the Nevi'im, right? There are examples in which the Nevi'im interpret Peshukim. We just had that this week, right? The Haftorah that we read on Parshanut in many ways is a Peshat on the Techacha, right? That's part of what's going on. Maybe if we push it back even further, you'll say Moshe Rabbeinu himself. Right? Moshe Rabbeinu, in a sense, is a commentary on Devar Hashem. Maybe Sefer Devarim is Moshe's Perush in some level of depends exactly what Sefer Devarim is, Machlekes Rishonim. It's Moshe's speech in which he reminds people of the Torah and sometimes gives it a certain angle. But the real answer to it is that, in a sense, the earliest bit of Torah Sheba'al Peh we have are the laning notes and vowels of the Torah. What do I mean by that? That in the Sefer Torah is just written the words of the Torah, the letters of the Torah. You can't interpret the Torah without vowels. If you don't have vowels, you don't know how to read the Torah. And in Lashon HaKodesh, vowels change the meaning of the words. I mean, in English, it's also in a sense like that, right? The words bed and bead and bade and boyd and so on are just vowel differences, and they mean very different things. And Lashon HaKodesh is the same thing, except we don't have vowels as letters; we have vowels as symbols. And the vowels of the Torah is the first piece of Torah Sheba'al Peh. They didn't have chumashim with physical vowels underneath them, so it was already transmitted. It's a piece of Torah Sheba'al Peh. It's a piece of old Torah that explains the Torah. Similarly, the punctuation changes the meaning of a sentence. Where you put the full stop and where you put the comma, and whether you have a question mark or an exclamation mark, changes the meaning of a sentence. If you don't have punctuation, you can interpret a verse in many different ways. And trop, the laning notes, is the punctuation that we have of the Torah. So between the vowels and the punctuation system, you have a vast body of Torah Sheba'al Peh, which would be lost without without and Torah itself would be lost without this vast body of Torah Sheba'al Peh. We often used to saying that let's say the Karaites denied Torah Sheba'al Peh, and in many ways Hillel made this argument first, right? The ger, the convert who comes to a potential convert who comes to seek Hillel, right? There's a number of potential converts who come to speak to Hillel, and each of them has a unique demand. And the demand of one of them is, I want to learn Torah Sheba'al Peh, I want the written Torah, without any Torah Sheba'al Peh. So we don't know the history behind this story particularly, but this particular convert is perhaps very wowed by the beauty of the written Torah. Torah Sheba'al Peh is not so convinced of. Maybe he's influenced by they weren't characters at the time of the Mishnah, but he's influenced maybe by the Kusim, the Shamronim, the Samaritans, or the Tzedokim, the Sadducees, but he's influenced by somebody, and he comes to Hillel and he says, I want to learn Torah Sheba'al, not Torah Sheba'al Peh. And Hillel says to him, fine, no problem, I'll teach you. Shammai is not happy with him, Shammai chases him away, there's no such thing. Hillel says, let's learn. And he teaches him the first day. He says, okay, here's the beginning of the class, Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Dalet, right? Next day, the guy comes back, and Hillel points to the same letters and says, Toshin, Reish Kuv. So the guy says, you're contradicting himself. So he said, you see, without Torah Sheba'al Peh, you can't even know the letters. In other words, there's always an oral component to any system. Something has to have some living tradition in some shape or form in order to be meaningful. If you have no lived tradition whatsoever, it's impossible to decipher. Right? There are and were ancient languages which we are simply unable to decipher. We have no clue. We were only able to decipher some of them when we could attach them to a living tradition. So the Rosetta Stone was found, and the Rosetta Stone translated Egyptian hieroglyphics into Greek. Greek we still have a living tradition of, and therefore we can do it. Yet there's some chain that of to a living tradition in order to even know the pronunciation and even the meanings of words. So this is the same in Torah itself, in the Torah. On the most basic level, the very names of the letters, the very translation of words, the vowelling of words, which affects their meanings, and the punctuation of sentences, all of these are triggered by, are directed to us by Torah Sheba'al Peh, and without it, we wouldn't have any even shutish or mikra reading.
Someone's got a problem connecting to Zoom. Is it on? Is everyone who's their head listening?
You can hear me, yes, if you can just nod. Yeah, you're able to hear me. I've noticed there's less than normal people on it, so I assume it's because of the Mizrahi thing or something, but people, maybe there's a problem with people getting on. Okay, sorry. Yeah, just I'll upload the recording, it's the best I can do. Not sure what the problem is. Also with problems to get on. Are they on?
He said, is there a shield we can't hear it?
I don't know. There must be a problem with the Zoom. Just tell them the problem with the Zoom and I'll upload it. I did notice we had less people here, so. Okay, nothing I can do, I'm afraid. We have a Balkar on board, thank you, David, who points out that sometimes even the stress changes the meaning. Right, so amongst the most difficult jobs of Balei Korah and those who like pouncing on Balei Korah alike is to know normally we don't correct for minor errors which don't change the meaning, and stress very often doesn't change the meaning, but there are yes, bar and bar, yes, yeah, but sorry, bar and bar, as pointed out I think by Rashi over there. Yes, okay, so there are cases where the stress can change the meaning, and again the stress certainly is Torah Sheba'al Peh. Yeah, sorry. 100%, yes. They did believe in a tradition. In fact, some of the greatest Bali Masorah we think were Karaites. Yes. So Hillel's point isn't that they would dispute. Obviously, they read Hebrew and know how to read Hebrew. His point is that you can't dispute the concept of tradition, and therefore the debate between the Karaites and us simply gets down to the nature of this tradition, so which in a way will tie into some of the stuff we talk about. But yes, 100%, you're right. We don't know, by the way, that much about what the Samarites and the Tzedokim believe. The Karaites we know much more about because the Chazal address the halachic status of the Kushim many times, but not really their theology. And the Tzedokim, a few times, there's a few snippets in Chazal about Tzedoki said X, and Chazal replied Y. We don't have like a consistent framework. By the time you get to the Karaites, So you have 400 years worth of their literature and our literature to have a look at and see what they were saying and what we were saying and so on. And on a very small scale, the Karaites still exist to this day. So there's still, the Samaritans to this day, though, it's completely, it doesn't fit with, it's completely veered off. It's not, I don't think there's a sort of meaningful theology that's accessible to us. I mean, it has a meaningful theology, like every religion has. There's not one that in any way talks to us at all. And the Karaites are still around. There's still a very small community of Karaites with a shul of sorts in Ramla area, and a lot of halachic discourse amongst Israeli Passukim, Rabbi Yosef and others, what the halachic status of Karaites is. Yes. Yeah. So in Egypt, there remains a Karaite community. It wasn't very big, but there remains a Karaite community. And in East Europe, there were Karaites, Yiddish-speaking, long-bearded Karaites who were around, who, again, they sort of went on a parallel journey with Jews. As we spread out into Golas, they spread out. In the Rambam, in the times of the Gaonim and the Rambam, we think there were significant numbers of Karaites. So the Gaonim saw them as a serious threat and engaged in, and in the Rambam also engaged in very serious criticism of the Karaites. Famously in the Cairo Geniza, there's a ksuva between a Karaite and a, what we call an Orthodox Jew, whatever we might call it. They fell in love, wanted to get married, and they had to negotiate how they would run their home. And they put all of that in the ksuva about, she promises that she keep all the laws of kashrus in line with halach, and he promises he keep her promise and so on. So I don't know if their marriage did well or not. We're not told about that, but they negotiated in the ksuva how they would live their life together.
The Samaritans were born, but don't worry.
But they carried on. That was the Karaite community. There was a lot of controversy because in the Holocaust they managed to convince the Nazis that they weren't Jews and therefore shouldn't be included in the Holocaust. And there's a lot of controversy around that and what to make of all that. And it's quite, for those that are interested in history, you can read up about it. It's quite interesting.
Yeah. I'm not sure whether they consider even Ezra the cash one they have in their arrangements with the considerations.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll get to the character of Ibn Ezra later. It's the Ibn Ezra is one of the figures that engages in polemics against Karaites, but it's true that he believed that it was legitimate to have Peshat without Midrash, without Torah Shel. He believed there were readings of the Torah that could emerge without the Masorah of Torah Shel that had a legitimacy to them, and therefore there were Karaites that seized on that and said, "Oh, so you see that Ibn Ezra is one of us." The Ibn Ezra has a number of polemics against the Karaites because he wasn't saying that that this is the only reading of the Torah, and he even believed that Peshat has to be tweaked by Torah Shel, but he did believe that the two are somewhat separate, and we'll get to that. We'll get to that later. Now, for now. We're simply exploring the relationship between Peshat and Torah Shel, and the first model we're looking at is that you need Torah Shel for Peshat. You can't. It's not an alternative. It's not different levels of meaning. The two are intertwined. You can't learn one without the other. The written Torah simply isn't the sort of work that can be learned without a oral component or an oral tradition. That's the very modest statement I'm making. And the example I used on Shabbat HaKotel is the very first pasuk in the Torah. You can use any pasuk in the Torah. That's the whole point. I just picked the very first pasuk in the Torah, in which there's a massive technical problem with the first pasuk, and it's a self-made problem. Meaning, if you are willing to vowel the first pasuk differently, you can resolve the whole issue. Bereshis bara Elokim makes no grammatical sense because Bereshis means in the beginning of, bara means Elokim. It means Hashem created. So in the beginning of, Hashem created. And the first Rashi al Torah addresses it, and he brings Midrashim to resolve it. It doesn't mean in the beginning, it means for the sake of Rashis, for the sake of the Jewish people. Rashi brings Midrashim to reject it. But the reason for the problem is because the sentence doesn't make sense. Bereshis, in the beginning of, Bara Elokim, Hashem created. If you would vowel it differently, you could resolve the whole issue. Bereshis, in the beginning of, Baroi Elokim, the creating of Hashem, or the creation of Hashem. If you vowel it as Baroi Elokim, the beginning of the creation of God, or the creating of God, then you have no grammatical problem, and the whole sentence reads easily, and you don't have any sources for the Midrashim. So the Masorah that we had was that the voweling is Bereshis bara Elokim, and that Masorah created a diktuk problem. The sentence doesn't make sense in grammar, and then you need Midrashim to interpret it. But it's all built on Torah Shel ultimately of a Masorah of how to read the Passukim, and that's the source of the issue. Let's shift though from narrative to halacha, and I'll just give an example of a halachic debate, because I mentioned really you have the same question in halacha, how the two work together, and this comes down to, in a sense, practical halacha also. There is a pasuk, lifnei iver lo sitting michshol, in front of a blind person, do not put the stumbling block. V'yoreisem elokach, and you should fear Hashem, fear your God. Ki ani Hashem, for I am Hashem. A pasuk in Kedoshim, a nice pasuk. Don't put a stumbling block in front of a blind person. Right? So it doesn't need my scholar to nice pasukim. Okay, so what's this pasuk mean? So famously, Chazal interpret it to mean don't give bad advice and don't cause people to stumble in their observation of Torah. So if someone says to me, can you pass that piece of pork meat? Don't pass it to them. Don't cause people to stumble in keeping Torah law. And then there's a bunch of halachas about the parameters of this and how that works and so on. Fine. So two questions. Why did Chazal interpret this pasuk in this way? Why didn't they interpret it in a simple way of, in front of a blind person, don't put a stumbling block, don't cause a blind person to trip up, number one. And number two, does the pasuk also mean that? Does it only mean this midrashic reading? Again, we're used to medrash meaning sort of stories and so on, but there's a halachic medrash. Does it only mean this Torah shebal peh midrashic reading of the pasuk, or does it also mean that literally don't put a stumbling block in front of a blind person? If I put a stumbling block in front of a blind person, have I transgressed this issa of lifnei velo sitein michshol? So the answer to question number one of why Chazal interpreted this pasuk in this way, we don't really know. We can speculate, but we don't have a source. Very interesting. Chazal don't exactly tell us why they interpreted it in this way. However, there's a number of suggestions. The first suggestion is they thought the literal meaning was an unreasonable one, because there's another category that you fall under if you do that. You're a mazik. Mazik's not a new halacha. The whole of Mishpatim and the whole of Shotim is about don't be mazik people. If you put a burr, a pit, that's a pasuk, a burr. So whether the person is blind or whether they have sight and they just don't see the pit because it's covered with leaves or whatever it is, conceptually it's the same thing happening. And they didn't think it was reasonable that the pasuk meant it literally, because that's already been dealt with extensively in halacha. That's one way perhaps of understanding it. An alternative is there is a pattern to Sefer Kedoshim in which, other than this pasuk, there is no exception, in which whenever it says, V'yoresa me'elokach, you should fear God, ki ani Hashem, it's talking about something which is pretty invisible, pretty, not something that's observable or clear or physical and tangible. V'hafta re'echa kamocha, ani Hashem, etc. So things which rely on yiras shamayim, on internal godliness and fear of God, which rely on your self-honesty, and things which are very intimately connected with your relationship with Hashem. That's where the pasuk says, if you think of the Kedoshim is a fascinating sedra with an awful mix of different sorts of things going on, and very often a mix followed by Kedoshim is a sedra of Kedusha, right? It's Kedoshim too, it's a sedra of Kedoshim. So the Kliyaka points out that, and many others point out that this is a pattern throughout things, and Lifnei Iver seems very much an exception to this, right? It doesn't say don't murder, don't hit someone, because this is an obviously not a machavera. It doesn't take particularly Yerushalayim, and it's not invisible. It's very transparent. It's a very physical act that courts can deal with. So if the pasuk is to be taken literally, it's textually different, and maybe this is the source of Chazal interpreting it midrashically. It refers to something much more subtle than literally putting a physical stumbling block in front of a person. It refers to giving bad advice, for example. It's very hard to tell if you gave someone bad advice. You may have a motive to give someone bad advice. You don't like them. You want the investment to fail. You're a competitor with them. You whatever it is, and you don't want them to intrude on your turf. Whatever your motive is for giving them bad advice. No one may ever be able to tell. You can argue, I thought that this was a good investment, I didn't know. Therefore the pasuk says, so halacha l'maisa, in practical halacha, if you literally put a stumbling block in front of a blind person, have you transgressed this law or not? And that there could be nafkaminas, the halacha, as to whether you get the punishment for transgressing love, if there's no monetary compensation available. You get makkos, for example. We could speculate on all sorts of distinctions in practical halacha. So this turns out to be a machlokes rishonim. Very interesting. The Rambam and the Kliyaka references this when he comments on this, says that lifnei iver doesn't mean literally. It's a metaphor. Read it as a metaphor. The Peshuto Shel Mikra, the simplest understanding of the pasuk is the metaphor. there is no Peshat in which it's referring to a literally visually impaired person and a literally stumbling block. It's a pasuk that halachically needs to be read midrashically, needs to be read poetically. The Peshat of the pasuk is a metaphor. There is no verse in the Torah that tells you don't put a stumbling block physically in front of a blind man. That's the Rambam's model of this pasuk. The pasuk is not talking about a literal stumbling block. It's just a poetic verse. And even in halacha, we read verses poetically. That's how halacha works. Other Rishonim, the Sefer Chinuch, and Chachma, and Passukim, even the Ramosha Feinstein and the Noda B'Yehuda and others, all assume this is not correct. And they say, no, of course the pasuk means literally don't put a stumbling block, and it also means poetically don't put a stumbling block, and the pasuk's read on multi-tiered level. So we see already here these sort of two models of the relationship between Peshat and Midrash. At least in this case, as in the view of the Kliyaka and the Rambam, the pasuk can't be read. You can't learn Peshat-wise the pasuk. It has to be read as a piece of halachic poetry. That's the only way to understand, or metaphor. That's the only way to understand the pasuk. Yeah. The point about Ayin Tachat Ayin, which is a very good example, no one in practical halacha reads it literally like that. But even there's the two models. Is it that the translation of Ayin Tachat Ayin is pay monetary compensation? Or no, the translation is knock out an eye for an eye, but the halacha is in line with the Midrash. So in general, again, when you learn Gemara, it's clear that practical halacha follows the midrashic reading, not the literal, not what we would call the literal meaning. The question is, why is that? So one answer to the question is because there is no literal meaning. The literal meaning is the midrashic reading. The second answer to the question is both exist, but halacha is fixed by midrashic reading, or also fixed by midrash reading. So again, let's take our example of Lifnei Iver, and then we'll look at Ayin Tachat Ayin. So in Lifnei Iver, one model is the simple meaning is a blind person, a stumbling block, and that has halachic ramification. And the midrashic meaning is a metaphor, and both have halachic ramification. In Ayin Tachat Ayin, what's going on? So one explanation of an eye for an eye is that it means an eye for an eye, and for some reason or other, the oral tradition says that's not what we do in practice. So there's a Sfano that says this, and various other Mefarshim. They say that what the pasuk is indicating is that by rights, if you knock someone's eye out, your eye ought to be knocked out. However, in practice, this isn't the halachic system, and in practice, you pay monetary compensation. In other words, what the pasuk is saying is that money isn't enough to really compensate for doing damage to a human being. If you damage an ox is a monetary article, and certainly if you damage someone's car or their pot, right, then monetary compensation is the appropriate way to deal with it. You diminish their monetary worth, so you compensate the money. A human being is not a monetary entity. A human being is a human being. We're not just items of monetary value. And therefore, in truth, corporal punishment should be the consequence. If you murder someone, you don't give compensation, you get put to death for it. So if you knock out an eye, there should be a mini putting to death that's done, that your eye should be knocked out. In and of in itself, a human isn't someone that should be subject to Parshas Mishpatim. This is not tort law. This is mini murder. This is damage of a human being who's a human. Nonetheless, the more appropriate punishment in practical halacha is monetary compensation, and Chazal derive on a midrashic level that there's a second tier. So that's one reason of it, that both the simple reading of the pasuk, the Peshuto Mikra, the translation of the pasuk, and the halachic or midrashic reading reveal two layers of truth. That's what I meant by the complement model, where both are revealing two different layers. One is telling you in sort of a fundamental value that there's something obscene about thinking about monetary compensation for knocking a human being's eye out. This is ridiculous. In the same way as I think we all instinctively understand that for murder, this is ridiculous. I don't know, by the way, why it's obvious to us. It's very interesting when people talk about Ayin Tachat Ayin, besides this being an interesting sort of Torah discussion, academic discussion, there's also this idea that somehow Lex Talonis, the idea of doing to someone what they did to someone else, is primitive. We live in the West, by the way, where the whole idea of corporal punishment, at least in European West, the whole idea of corporal punishment makes us a bit squeamish, and we don't like that. Our cousins across the Atlantic, with no disrespect to them, to think capital punishment is okay. it's maybe a discussion for another day why we're squeamish about capital punishment and the wrongs and rights of it. But I don't know, in and of itself, it's obvious that Lex Talonis is a primitive form of punishment and it's something terrible. Maybe not, maybe it's an appropriate thing to do. I'll come to a second. But either way, the one model of understanding is no, Ayin Tachat Ayin in Peshat means an eye for an eye. In Midrash and Halacha follows that, it means monetary compensation. And both are revealing an important truth. That's model number one. Model number two will be, I'll pause in a moment just to let you ask, but model number two will be, no, the Peshuto Shel Mikra, the correct translation of the Pasuk is monetary compensation, and we've mistranslated the Pasuk. So even an example like Ayin Tachat Ayin, which you're right, in practical halacha, no one takes it like that. Doesn't mean that there's no, it doesn't mean that there's not room for the two models, yes. 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 So the Gemara in Baba Kama, it basically spends a daf and a half discussing Ayin Tachat Ayin. By the way, what would happen if we found in archaeology, let's say one day we found an archaeological evidence that there was a time in Jewish history where they literally did Ayin Tachat Ayin. So what would we say? It's machlokas. Gemara already tells us in Machlokas, right? There were different days in Gemara, and lots of things are machlokas and halacha, right? That's one possible answer. There are those who claim that no, this is incorrect. Since this is a living part of halacha and Moshe Sinai, it can't be there was ever debate about this. But at least one understanding of the Gemara is the Gemara is genuinely debating it, and for lots of reasons, the Gemara comes to the conclusion that either the Peshat or the Midrashic reading, and one of the points the Gemara makes is that Ayin Tachat Ayin is not possible. A merchant of Venice type logic, you can't surgically just remove the eye. You also can't make it equal because different people have different relationships to the eye. What happens if a one-eyed man knocks someone's eye out? You're doing more damage than people's eyes aren't identical, their vision isn't identical. So possibly part of the reason is that Lex Talonis is a nice principle. In practice, if you buy into a principle of justice, of doing to the criminal that which they do to the victim, that's impossible to apply. That's one of the stories in the Gemara.
So isn't Midrash telling us we kind of the rabbis have decided in their wisdom that we can't follow this because we have to find this? Or they think this was always the.
We don't really know. That's the problem over here. There's two models. Model number one is that whole page and a half of the Gemara and moral reasoning, like you can't apply Lex Talonis ever equitably, is telling us that the Pasuk was never meant to be translated in that way. It was always meant as a metaphor of sorts. I think when it comes to the metaphor of in front of a blind person, don't put a stumbling block, we can all live with the idea that a Peshuto Shel Mikra might mean a metaphorically blind person and a metaphorical stumbling block. We know that's the way poetry works, as it were. And with Ayin Tachat Ayin, maybe we struggle with it more, and in a moment we'll analyze the words. But model number one is that all these Midrashim are telling us that this was never what the Pasuk said. It's a mistranslation. Model number two is no, it is what the Pasuk said, but in halacha it's not true. But the Pasuk is also teaching us a moral value or a concept that really there's something obscene about monetary compensation for physical damage. The nafkamina will be if I learn the Pasuk in Peshuto Shel Mikra, how do I translate the Pasuk? If I'm teaching a child or an adult, and I say, well, this is a Peshat shir, we're not going to learn Midrash, right? This is a Peshat shir. Peshat is a layer of reasoning. So I just want to learn Peshat. So is it that the only way to translate the Pasuk is monetary compensation? Model number one, or is it no? There's a Peshat of an eye for an eye, and it's a legitimate chedek of Torah. I can make bechas Torah on just translating it, Ayin Tachat Ayin, eye for an eye, right? Translating the Pasuk like that, and it's legitimate for me to miss out the Midrash because we're not learning Midrash today. We're learning Peshat. That's also a legitimate translation. It's a very real question as to what the translation of Passukim are.
Let's take Peshat level of Lifnei Ever. Did they have piles of people in the Karaites every street corner? Because you could say Lifnei Ever lo sitem Shel, but everyone else is fine. In other words, for a blind man, don't put a stone, but everyone else you can put. I mean, you can read it like that.
Okay, so I'm not going to talk about the Karaites because the Karaites themselves did have their own interpretation system. In principle, if you miss that Midrash, then that's our question. Is the Pasuk saying in front of a blind person, don't, but nothing else?
Everyone, they'll say, this is a crazy society. And for the mild and meek or the people, we have to be careful. But everyone else, you can cheat and you can do this.
Sorry, one second. Even in secular legal systems, there are differences between professionals and amateurs. As far as I understand, and I'm no lawyer, so please, sorry. As far as I understand, in English law, if I am professional and I provably give someone misadvice, I can be culpable for that. If I'm an individual and I just choose to prank them and mess them around, even though it leads to serious inconvenience for them, as far as I understand, there's nothing illegal about that.
Financial services.
In financial services,
you can get stuck
if
you give the wrong
you're an accountant, if you're a lawyer, if you're
if you get involved in that, you're not allowed to. So a regular person actually.
If my friend calls me up and happens to record the call, and he says, should I invest in company A or company B? And I say company A. And then the next call also recorded. I tell my friend, I told that fool to invest in company A, which I know is an awful investment. As far as I understand, there's no tort damages against me, and nothing can be done unless I'm in the business, unless it's a professional consultation. That's as far as my understanding is. So you can run a society perfectly well without, other than professionals, without lifnei over. By the way, in halacha, there's a degree of similarity to this. In that, when it comes to compensation, there's a degree of truth to this, which is regular lifnei isn't easily compensatable for unless you're a professional money changer who makes a mistake, or even in if someone's interested in buying a piece of art and they ask my advice. I went with my daughter on Monday. I went with my daughter in the bank holiday. I went with my daughter to the Museum of Modern Art in the Tate Modern. There are pieces there which are magnificent. There's pieces there which look like a 5-year-old's scrawling, and there's literally blank pieces of paper framed, and literally white pieces of paper framed, and so do you work with art. So it's very difficult to tell what art is for the layman. So someone asked me what I think about this in this investment of the piece of art, and I tell them I think it's great. I think everything is real, and they invest in it. As far as I know, there's no compensation. In halacha, if I'm an art dealer and I look at it and I'm lazy in my work and I don't spot that it's a fraud, a forgery, then there can be compensatory claims for that. So it's perfectly viable to run a society with a literal lifnei. It's a moral dimension of sensitivity to take it beyond that. Yeah.
Managed to change our day-to-day halacha without changing Peshat. So look at Amalek, look at Ben Sora Moreh, which everybody agrees that Peshat is the Peshat, but the actual halacha that we practice today has gotten rid of both systems.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpick on that, but you're correct. This doesn't fall in the parameters of this year when I'm looking at the text and how we read the text. So there could be situations in which, let's leave harmonic aside because harmonic is a little bit different. But Ben Torah is a very interesting example of this, and it is one of the examples I was thinking of looking at. Because Ben Torah, by the time the Torah Shebal Peh finishes with it, makes it effectively almost unmanageable. Like it's almost never going to happen. And then Shemon Kalenu, right? So the kol has to be, I think we had the speaker recently spoke about this, right? The kol has to be identical. This is what Chazal say, it has to be exactly the same kol. Now, according to practical halacha, that means even the parents' pitch has to be the same and the like. So it builds up and builds up until, as the Gemara says, according to one opinion, right? It will never be and can never be. So there we could analyze this sort of discussion. What are Chazal doing over there? Is this? But it's a bit of a different. It's a bit beyond the remit of what we're talking about over here, in which we're looking at Peshuto and Mikra. Just very briefly, just to finish Ayin Tachat Ayin, since that was your example, there's two models with Ayin Tachat Ayin. Model number one is that Peshuto and Mikra is an eye for an eye, but in practical halacha we don't do that for some reason or other. But both translations, both readings have importance. One is the literal reading of the pasuk. And that's the chelik of Torah, that's called Talmud Torah to translate it that way, because it's teaching us something of Torah that by rights an eye for an eye has a component to it. Don't just think of it as a monetary punishment. And in practical law, we use it in a second tier. The alternative is this is a mistranslation of the pasuk. It's never what the pasuk said. The translation of Ayin Tachat Ayin is monetary compensation. The Gemara Baba Kama brings such a sad. It says the pasuk says the language of the pasuk is after it says Ayin Tachat Ayin, it's not the end of the pasuk. It then says kasher nosam, just as someone so you should give to the person. In other words, the Ayin Tachat Ayin is given as you should give an eye. And in fact, the translation of the phrase Ayin Tachat Ayin is ayin, an eye, tachat ayin, in place, underneath an eye. In other words, an eye in place of an eye. So I knocked out someone's eye. I should give them, that's the language of the pasuk, yitain, an ayin tachat ayin, an eye underneath an eye in place of an eye. How can I, in other words, I've done damage to you, I should replace your eye. How can I replace your eye in the absence of technology that allows us to do eye transplants? The answer is the best replacements I can. So what's been taken away from you? The physical functioning of the eye, the vision, the pain, the embarrassment, the loss of earnings, the need for medical treatment. And these are exactly the 5 types of compensation that the pasuk lays out. Pay them for tsar, for physical pain, boshes, for emotional pain, pay them compensation for their loss of capital worth, pay them compensation for sheves, for their loss of earnings, and pay them refuah, pay them for medical care. So the very 5 compensations which the Gemara lists is the best we can do to replace an eye with an eye. So in the second model, the translation of the pasuk, Peshuto Shel Mikra is replace an eye with an eye, i.e., do the best that we humanly can to replace the eye. If we enter a world in which it's possible to give them an eye transplant or restore their vision to what it was, then that would be included in refuah, and that's what we'd have to do. We'd still have to compensate for the tsar and for the loss of earnings they had whilst they were under anesthetic and recovering, and the brochures for the humiliation, but then maybe we wouldn't pay anything else because there would be no loss of capital value because they've received a transplanted eye. Fantastic, right? If it functions less well, then we'd pay for that. But the core of the pasuk. So in this explanation, it was a mistranslation from the start to ever translate the pasuk as Lex Talonis as an eye for an eye. This isn't because the Torah has a problem with Lex Talonis. There's one example where everyone agrees it has Lex Talonis, which is Ayin Tachat Ayin. Like the plotting witnesses, paradoxically, they didn't succeed in their goal, but they plotted to get someone put to death, and we put the plotting witnesses to death. They plotted to defraud someone of 200 zuz by lying that he owed 200 zuz, and they'll have to give 200 zuz. So the principle that you sometimes punish a criminal for doing what they did, or at least wanted to do in the case of the Ayin Tachat Ayin, is not one that Chazal were morally averse to, or the Torah was morally averse to. It's a pasuk that says you do that. But the language of the pasuk is very different, because in that pasuk it indeed says, that which they wanted to do, that which they wanted to do to their fellow, so should be done to them. But in Ayin Tachat Ayin is not what the pasuk says. The pasuk says, Yitain, you should give. And the language is Ayin Tachat Ayin, and I Petza Tachas Patza. You should give a compensation for it. And therefore, in this explanation, Chazal understood it as Peshuto Shel Mikra. Okay, so to summarize what we've said so far, when we learn Midrashim, whether Agadata or Halacha, we certainly need to ask ourselves what the Midrash is doing. Is the Midrash revealing a deeper level of Pshat, or is the Midrash giving an alternative level, right? Is it an alternate level or a deeper level? Can you learn Peshat without the insight of Midrash? In Ayin Tachat Ayin, the argument goes that you can't. If you just translate the pasuk superficially, you'll miss what the pasuk is really saying, which is Ayin Tachat Ayin means compensation, or maybe not. Maybe the pasuk is saying an eye for an eye, and it's teaching us something there, but it's also telling us a deeper layer there. Is the pasuk telling us don't put stumbling block in front of a blind person, but also metaphorically, poetically speaking, or is it only telling us the metaphor? Again, we don't know. I'll give one final example of this, just to sort of tie this up. But there's so many. I mean, there's infinite examples, and maybe even in the next week, people, slightly more people now online, and like can go through their learning, or if you're doing your Daf Yomi or your Mishnah Gemara, just have a look at each Rosh and ask yourself this question: is the Gemara telling me Pshat, or is it telling me Midrash? And I'll tell you one final example of this, where again I think the metaphor works for a lot of us. And the pasuk talks about a bar b'machteres. So the basic halacha is that if someone tunnels into my home, in other words, breaks into my home, I am entitled to defend my property, such that there is a risk that the attacker will fight back and kill me, and therefore in legitimate self-defense I can kill the intruder. And also you have the right to kill an intruder if there's a possibility that the intruder is dangerous, right? You have to make a judgment call. The pasuk then says, "In zarcha olav hashemesh." However, if the sun shines on the intruder, domim lo, then they have blood. You can't kill the intruder if the sun shines on them. So the question is, what on earth this pasuk means if the sun shines on them? So the Gemara says it means if the sun shines on them, in other words, you have clarity that this person poses no threat. For example, you get down and you discover the intruder is your father. Right, so it's very sad that he's stealing from you, but he's not going to. This is not going to turn dangerous, right? That's not going to happen. So if you have clarity that the intruder is no threat to you, then you can't take the intruder out. Is that Peshuto Shel Mikra or Midrash? Right? Is the pshat of the pasuk if the sun shines on him, then don't take him out, or is it midrashic? The simplest understanding is it's pshat. The pasuk is using metaphoric language to tell you if it's blatantly obvious that there's no threat, so that you're allowed to take out an intruder if you have a genuine possibility that this individual poses a threat to you. But if you know that the intruder is no threat, then there's no allowance dominantly. He has blood, you're not allowed to take him out. That's the pasuk. So again, I just share this as another example of halachic literature where we take a poetic reading of a pasuk, and again, halacha is full of that, where metaphor and poetry in the eyes of Chazal wasn't just legitimate when it comes to Hazinu or, Beshalach to the Shir HaSayam or poetry in the Torah. It was also legitimate in halachic Peshuto Mikra and dry laws of damages. It was also legitimate, and Chazal presumably, I can't prove this, but presumably they saw that as Peshuto Mikra rather than midrashic reading.
I mean, most robberies would take place at night and dark.
Yes.
And immediately that's going to, what does it mean? Does that mean, in fact, if it takes place at night, then I don't have a problem with this?
No, this is Chazal's point, that day and night doesn't make a difference over it. If it's day and you're completely isolated and alone, then you're at the same risk as at night. And if it's night and you've got 500 guest rounds for a party, then it's just the same. So that's exactly their point. The Zar Chaloch HaShemesh is not the literal sun shining, it's making assessments as to the danger.
By one person.
I think everyone in their initial reading might not, but when you analyze it, they would say, oh yeah, not say. If someone said to me, the pshat is at night you can kill intruders and day not, and I said to them, what happens if I'm alone? I'm in a very, very isolated, I've got my house alone in the middle of Dartmoor, and it's daytime. Would you think then I can also take them out because no one's around? And they say, yeah. And I say, what happens if it's night, but I'm in the middle of the West End and there's hundreds of people around? Would you then be able to take them out? And they say, no, they're not. So everyone will immediately shift into metaphor, and they'll say day and night is just an example. So immediately we understand, like Chazal. So it's true at first reading, maybe you wouldn't, but I think after a little bit of analysis, everyone understands it's a metaphor, an example, or something like that. But it's not the legal principle is not day and night, right? And we have to work out, is it shkia or shacha, or check on my zmanim, is it after nacht or before nacht? No, I don't think anyone would read it like that. No, I don't know.
Is there a slight difference if you say that this is the key principle, capturing the key principle? It's daylight, which is your point, isn't it?
Whether you understand it, however you understand it, I think everyone would understand that the Peshuto Shel Mikra never meant the key distinction to be day and night. It was using day and night either as a metaphor for clarity or as an example of danger and non-danger. But in Peshuto Shel Mikra, that's not the essence of the legal principle. I take your point. In other words, right.
That's why I said it. I'm not when it comes to
I take Charles' point. Maybe I should have phrased it more care, and rather than just taking the metaphor model, we should have also taken the example model. That it's an example of clarity, but not the only example. But I think in practical application, no one would. I think it's legitimate that I don't think Peshuto Shel Mikra would be only day and night. I think that's reasonable.
But Rabbi Zobin, as a matter of interest. I haven't done criminal law since 1967 when I was at Oxford, but I think the law is still the same. It's only burglary at night, and in the daytime it's called housebreaking. So even sophisticated English law makes a difference between coming at night or in the day.
I'm not going to argue with you. I don't know if it's been changed since 1967 or not. I've no idea.
I just looked on Google actually, and it does say burglary is only at night.
That's interesting, very interesting. Okay. Yeah. Okay, we have a machlokas your friend and colleague Simon Levy is arguing with it. Okay, we'll stop here because we are running out of time. Just to summarize, whether my example of Baba Machteres was a good one or not, maybe I should stand corrected. But as a principle, whenever we learn a drasha of Chazal, we need to probe and ask ourselves: is this the phrase that I'll just finish with one final thought, which is in the 1800s and early 1900s, a series of achronim began delving into the issue of drashas of Chazal. It's very interesting, and now is not the time to go into this in too much detail. But in the same way as intellectual interests shift over generations, you see in Torah the same thing happening. You see periods in history in which one chelek of Torah is very, very popular, and then it goes out of popularity. One style of learning is very popular, and it goes out of popularity, and then it comes back in fashion. So if we chart the course of sort of intellectual Jewish history, in the times of Chazal, it's very clear they engaged significantly with Midrash. We don't find much of Chazal about Peshat. Very interesting. Either because it was obvious to them, or because it didn't interest them so much. We don't know, but they didn't engage that much in Peshat. If you look at the Rishonim, pre-Rashi, and Rashi is the watershed figure in this, they're engaging quite significantly in Midrash. The last serious Peshat engagement was the Gaonim in the sort of 700-800s. With Rashi, there's a shift back to an interest in Peshat, and you have suddenly a resurgence of interest in Peshat. You get to the 1600s, not much engagement in Peshat, all the way through to the 1800s. In the 1800s and on, there's a sudden resurgence of interest in Peshat, but with a unique twist and flavor, in which they are arguing that you need the Midrashic readings of Chazal to understand Omek Peshat, the depth of Peshat. So they argue that it's true that a superficial, lazy reading of Passukim might come out in one way, but if you engage in depth with the Passukim, you understand that they really meant what Chazal was saying. So, for example, Ayin Tachat Ayin or Baba Machteres might be an example of this. It's true you can read it as an eye for an eye or daylight at night, but if you really think deeply and ponder the language with care, you will see that the Omek of Peshat, the depth of Peshat, is like Chazal said. And if we just think about the flourishing of Torah that took place in that century, in the Meshech Chochmah and the Malbim and the Torah Tamima and the Ksaf Kabbalah and Samson Raphael Hirsch and so on, all of whom were adopting very similar style in very different commentaries, but all shared this Satar Shava, this common denominator, that that Pshat, that Midrash should be seen as Omek Pshat. You can only understand Passukim bearing in mind the Midrashic explanation also. So we'll try and look at this in more depth. There's no share next week, by the way. So the next share will be after Shavuos, and we'll try and look at this in more depth and understand this. But for now, as I said, maybe in our learning over the next couple of weeks and over Shavuos, every time you meet a Midrash or Drasha Chazal, just ask yourself: is this what's this doing? Is this a separate alternative reading, or is this Omek Pshat? And I'm going to argue that over the next couple of weeks that there's different models out there, and that there's different ways of looking at Peshat, and we'll try and look at some examples of that, and then that will get us to the Ibn Ezra and other characters who really push the limits of these ideas. Yeah. Okay.
Very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you very much.